When an elderly woman stepped into an upscale restaurant, no one imagined her quiet presence would unravel a hidden truth and bring the entire room to a halt. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the grand windows of Piton Bistro, a prestigious fine dining establishment in Portland, Oregon. Inside, the atmosphere hummed with a gentle murmur of conversation, the soft chime of crystal glasses meeting in toasts, and the elegant melodies of a live pianist playing in the corner. It was the kind of place where people gathered to celebrate life's milestones or finalize lucrative business deals, a sanctuary for the wealthy and the well-connected. Amid the polished elegance and tailored suits, the heavy entrance door swung open, revealing an elderly black woman. Her steps were slow but deliberate, her back held straight despite the weight of the years she carried. She wore a navy blue coat, its cuffs embroidered with delicate threadwork, and clutched a small black handbag close to her side. Though her face was calm, there was a quiet dignity in her presence, an unspoken authority that made a few heads turn in curiosity. The hostess at the podium greeted her with a polite but strained smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something subtle in the air, a flicker of hesitation that was almost imperceptible but undeniably there. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" the hostess asked, her gaze flickering over her shoulder as if checking to make sure she wasn't holding up more important guests. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the woman responded, her voice poised and unwavering. The hostess scanned the list, gave a brief nod, and led her toward a table near the kitchen, far from the prime seating in the heart of the restaurant. It wasn't the best spot, but Mrs. Holloway said nothing. With the grace of someone accustomed to unspoken slights, she simply took her seat, folded her hands gently on the table, and turned her attention to the menu. But something was off. Minutes passed. Then more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall young man named Todd, moved past her table multiple times, his gaze skipping over her as though she were invisible. Other guests, dressed casually, younger, louder, were being attended to swiftly, their orders taken with warm smiles and effortless charm. When Todd finally approached, his expression was tight, his tone clipped. "Sorry for the wait," he said flatly. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Holloway simply nodded, offering him a small, graceful smile. "Of course, take your time," she said, her voice betraying none of the discomfort curling in her chest. As she sat in the hush of her secluded corner, she noticed it, the subtle, lingering glances. A woman at a nearby table leaned in toward her partner, whispering, their eyes flickering in Mrs. Holloway's direction. A man at another table furrowed his brow, his expression puzzled, as if trying to place why she seemed out of sync with the rest of the room. Time dragged. Todd eventually returned, but his face showed no warmth, his demeanor no softer than before. "I'm sorry," he said, barely meeting her eyes. "We're a little short-staffed today. It might be a while before I can get to you." Mrs. Holloway's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave a slow nod, her voice as steady as ever. "That's quite all right. I understand." She wasn't about to cause a scene. She had no desire to fight for common courtesy, and yet the weight of the unspoken, the tension that hung in the air like a low hum, was undeniable. She had been here before, in different rooms, in different lifetimes. The same silence, the same glances, the same quiet dismissal wrapped in polite words. She folded her hands again, her fingers barely trembling, and waited. Just as Mrs. Holloway settled back into her chair, her expression composed, someone from across the room took notice. Their gaze darkened, their features tightening as they observed the quiet but unmistakable injustice unfolding before them. From her secluded corner, Mrs. Holloway remained still, her presence exuding a quiet dignity. This was not unfamiliar to her. The subtle neglect, the unspoken dismissiveness, the way certain people could make others feel invisible without ever raising their voices. It was a silent language she had learned to read long ago, woven into every delayed response, every averted glance, every seat tucked away near the kitchen instead of in the heart of the room. But she did not shift uncomfortably or let frustration crease her brow. She merely sat, hands resting gently on the table, as if she were simply passing time. Meanwhile, Todd moved fluidly through the restaurant, his demeanor light and effortless as he chatted with other patrons. His voice lifted in cheerful tones, laughter spilling from his lips as he took orders with ease. He walked past her table again, without a glance, without a word. At a nearby table, a young couple exchanged uneasy glances. The woman leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, lost beneath the melody of the pianist. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" she murmured, her eyes flicking toward Mrs. Holloway. Her partner shrugged, stealing a quick, uncertain glance toward Todd, who carried on without a care, oblivious to the weight of the moment growing heavier with each passing second. Minutes stretched unbearably long. Mrs. Holloway remained poised, her face unreadable, but deep within, a question echoed. How long would this go on? How far would this be allowed to continue? She reached for her water glass, only to find it still empty. Across the room, another guest, who had arrived well after her, received a fresh pour of wine without even having to ask. And then, finally, Todd returned. A tray of steaming dishes balanced in his hands, bound for another table. As he passed her, he slowed just enough to glance down at her, his voice tinged with something close to impatience. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, the words carrying an edge, as if the delay were somehow her fault. Mrs. Holloway lifted her gaze to his. Her eyes were steady, kind even, but beneath their warmth was a quiet intensity, one that made Todd hesitate for the briefest moment. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her tone even, her patience unwavering. Todd gave a short nod, muttered something under his breath, and walked away without another glance. But she was not the only one who had been watching. At a table near the bar, a man sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the table. He had observed every moment, every exchange, every small but deliberate slight. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer, he exuded a quiet, controlled presence, one that masked the slow-burning anger simmering beneath. His eyes narrowed. He had seen how Todd's demeanor changed from one table to the next, the way his smile came effortlessly for some, and vanished the moment he glanced in Mrs. Holloway's direction. He had caught the way Todd barely acknowledged her, the way he smirked at a fellow server as if sharing some unspoken joke. But more than that, he had recognized the look in his mother's eyes, the familiar practiced restraint of a woman who had spent a lifetime enduring such treatment. He gripped his glass a little tighter, because this was not just any diner. This was his restaurant. And Mrs. Holloway was not just any patron. She was his mother. Elijah Holloway had built Pemberton's Bistro from the ground up, pouring his soul into every detail, the menu, the ambiance, the values it was meant to uphold. It was supposed to be a place of excellence, of warmth, of respect, a reflection of the very principles his mother had instilled in him since childhood. Now, watching her be treated as though she did not belong in the space he had created, something inside him burned. He leaned back in his chair, fingers still tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the wood. Elijah was not a man prone to outbursts. He had learned, through years in the unforgiving restaurant industry, that patience was often the sharpest weapon in a battle. But this was different. This was personal. Every moment Todd ignored his mother, every slight smirk, every delay in service. It was an insult not just to her, but to everything Elijah had built. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a slow, steady fire building behind his calm exterior. The air in the restaurant had shifted. It was no longer just Mrs. Holloway who felt the tension. Others were noticing now. The glances were becoming longer, the hushed whispers more frequent. The unease was growing. Something had to give, and it was only a matter of time. For all his strength, all his accomplishments, Elijah Holloway had never felt as powerless as he did in that moment. His mother, the woman who had raised him with unwavering love, who had taught him the value of respect and dignity, was sitting just feet away, enduring treatment he would never allow for anyone, least of all her. And yet, she bore it with grace, as she always had. A storm raged inside him. Should he stand now, confront Todd, and lay bare his wrongdoing for the entire restaurant to witness? Or should he wait, let the moment stretch, ensure that when the reckoning came, there would be no room for denial, no space for excuses? He chose patience. Elijah caught the attention of Dana, the restaurant's manager, a woman in her early 50s with a sharp eye and years of experience. She approached cautiously, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Keep an eye on table 12, Elijah murmured, nodding toward his mother. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with an authority that left no room for question. "I want to see how Todd handles this. Don't step in, not yet." Dana hesitated for half a second before giving a short nod. She knew better than to challenge Elijah when he spoke like that. His gaze returned to his mother. She was checking her watch now, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Not in frustration, not in impatience, but as a simple acknowledgement of time passing. He knew she wouldn't complain. That was never her way. She had always believed in letting people's actions speak louder than any argument, and perhaps she was right. But Elijah also believed in actions. And soon Todd would face the consequences of his. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Conversations had softened. Patrons were glancing toward Mrs. Holloway, their curiosity turning into unease. Todd, however, either didn't notice or didn't care. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the lack of intervention. He strolled past her table once more, offering a fleeting glance before continuing his rounds. Mrs. Holloway finally lifted a hand, her voice calm but firm as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her words effortlessly cutting through the low murmurs of the restaurant. Todd halted, his expression tightening, his posture stiffening as if he had been inconvenienced. "Yes," he replied, the impatience barely concealed in his voice. "I'd like to place my order now," she said, her tone still gentle, still unwavering. "If you're not too busy." A sigh escaped Todd's lips, audible, exaggerated. He cast a glance around as if searching for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, already turning away before she could respond. And that was the moment Elijah stood. He moved with deliberate ease, his stride unhurried, yet each step carried a weight that seemed to shift the very air in the room. The low hum of conversation stilled. More eyes turned toward him now, sensing that something was about to happen. Elijah reached Todd just as the waiter was exchanging an easy laugh with another table, his demeanor light, arrogant, utterly unaware of the reckoning at his back. Only when he caught sight of Elijah standing beside him did the shift occur. The grin wavered. The confidence flickered. "Elijah," Todd stammered, attempting to salvage the moment with a forced smile. "I didn't know you were here." Elijah met his gaze, his expression unreadable, his voice steady. "I've been here." 3 words, yet they carried the weight of an entire storm. Todd swallowed. Watching what? Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table, then back to Todd, pinning him in place with a gaze that left no room for escape. "Watching you ignore my mother," he said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "who has been sitting there for nearly 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water." Todd paled. His eyes darted toward Mrs. Holloway, still seated with quiet dignity, still observing the moment with that same calm restraint. Your mother?" Todd's voice cracked, the weight of realization settling heavily on his shoulders. "Yes," Elijah said, his tone sharper now. "My mother. The woman you treated like she was an inconvenience. The woman you decided didn't deserve the same respect you've been handing out so freely to everyone else in this room." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the pianist had stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering above the keys. Todd opened his mouth, grasping for words, for excuses, but Elijah wasn't interested in hearing them. "Save it," he said coolly. "There's no explanation that will change what everyone in this room has seen for themselves." He turned to Dana, who had been lingering near the bar, uncertain whether to step in. "Dana," he said, his voice unwavering, "take over table 12. Make sure my mother has everything she needs. Immediately." Dana nodded without hesitation, striding quickly toward Mrs. Holloway's table. murmuring apologies as she filled her water glass and handed her a menu with a respectful urgency. Elijah turned back to Todd. The waiter stood motionless, humiliation washing over him in waves. "We'll discuss your future here later," Elijah said, his voice low but final. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Todd didn't argue. He knew there was nothing he could say to undo the damage, no way to turn back time. Slowly, he untied his apron, his hands trembling slightly, and walked toward the door. The restaurant remained hushed as the heavy door swung shut behind him. Elijah let the silence settle before finally making his way to his mother's table. As he crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his stern demeanor softened. His eyes filled with something deeper, something warmer. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Holloway smiled, reaching out to gently pat his hand. "I'm fine, son," she said. "I'm fine, son," she said, her voice steady with reassurance. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, a slow breath releasing the tension that had built in his chest. "I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head gently. "No, Elijah," she said, her voice laced with quiet wisdom. "You let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than any confrontation." Elijah held her gaze for a moment, letting her words settle. And as the restaurant slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, he knew one thing for certain. This place, his place, would never allow such an injustice to happen again. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, quieter, more reflective. Pemberton's bistro had changed in an instant. No one who had witnessed what had just unfolded would forget it, nor the lesson it carried. Respect was not a privilege to be rationed. It was a right, and tonight that truth had been laid bare for all to see. Elijah returned to his seat, his expression controlled, his posture composed. But the fire in his eyes had not yet faded entirely. The injustice, though addressed, still burned beneath the surface. Dana, the manager, moved with quiet urgency, personally overseeing every detail of Mrs. Holloway's service. When she placed the meal before her, her voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "Mrs. Holloway, I am so deeply sorry for the way you were treated tonight." Her apology wasn't just words. It was an attempt to repair what had been broken, an unspoken plea to undo the damage left behind by someone else's carelessness. Mrs. Holloway, ever graceful, met Dana's eyes and gave her a small, understanding nod before turning to her meal. She did not require grand apologies or elaborate justifications. She had always believed that dignity spoke for itself, and tonight it had. At a nearby table, a young couple leaned toward one another, their hushed conversation filled with disbelief. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman murmured, shaking her head. "How often does this happen when no one speaks up?" Her partner, thoughtful, let out a slow breath. "It's not just about noticing it," he said. "It's about having the courage to do something when it happens." Their words reached Elijah as he passed by. He didn't acknowledge them, but they settled in his mind like a stone. "I'm fine, son," she said, her voice steady with reassurance. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, a slow breath releasing the tension that had built in his chest. "I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head gently. "No, Elijah," she said, her voice laced with quiet wisdom. "You let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than any confrontation." Elijah held her gaze for a moment, letting her words settle. And as the restaurant slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, he knew one thing for certain. This place, his place, would never allow such an injustice to happen again. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, quieter, more reflective. Pemberton's bistro had changed in an instant. No one who had witnessed what had just unfolded would forget it, nor the lesson it carried. Respect was not a privilege to be rationed. It was a right, and tonight that truth had been laid bare for all to see. Elijah returned to his seat, his expression controlled, his posture composed. But the fire in his eyes had not yet faded entirely. The injustice, though addressed, still burned beneath the surface. Dana, the manager, moved with quiet urgency, personally overseeing every detail of Mrs. Holloway's service. When she placed the meal before her, her voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "Mrs. Holloway, I am so deeply sorry for the way you were treated tonight." Her apology wasn't just words. It was an attempt to repair what had been broken, an unspoken plea to undo the damage left behind by someone else's carelessness. Mrs. Holloway, ever graceful, met Dana's eyes and gave her a small, understanding nod before turning to her meal. She did not require grand apologies or elaborate justifications. She had always believed that dignity spoke for itself, and tonight it had. At a nearby table, a young couple leaned toward one another, their hushed conversation filled with disbelief. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman murmured, shaking her head. "How often does this happen when no one speaks up?" Her partner, thoughtful, let out a slow breath. "It's not just about noticing it," he said. "It's about having the courage to do something when it happens." Their words reached Elijah as he passed by. He didn't acknowledge them, but they settled in his mind like a stone sinking into still water. How many times had people like Todd acted with impunity simply because no one had been watching, or worse, because no one had cared enough to intervene? As the evening wound down and the last of the guests filtered out, Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave. Her composure, as always, remained intact, a steady presence amid the echoes of what had transpired. Elijah walked her to the door, stepping ahead to hold it open as she stepped out into the crisp night air. For a moment they stood together, bathed in the golden glow of the restaurant's windows, the world around them settling into a hushed stillness. She turned to him, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You did good tonight, son." Elijah let out a slow breath, his lips curving into a faint smile, but beneath the warmth of her praise, a flicker of regret still lingered. "I just wish it never had to happen at all." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "What matters isn't what happened, it's how you responded," she said, her words carrying the weight of experience, of wisdom hard-earned. "You gave everyone in that room something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's how change happens." Elijah nodded, watching as she made her way toward the car idling at the curb. Just before she climbed in, she turned back once more, offering him a final, knowing smile. Then, with quiet grace, she was gone. Inside, the restaurant staff moved with quiet efficiency, clearing tables and shutting down for the night. But there was something different in the air now. An unspoken understanding, a collective awareness that had settled over them like a heavy but necessary weight. Dana gathered the team near the bar, her expression firm but not unkind. "What happened tonight was a wake-up call," she said, her voice steady. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the kind of place we want to be, about the culture we build every single day. Because respect isn't optional, it's the foundation of who we are." The staff nodded, some lowering their gazes, others exchanging glances filled with unspoken thoughts. Todd's absence was a stark reminder that actions had consequences, that prejudice, however subtle, had no place within these walls. Elijah lingered near the edge of the dining room, his gaze sweeping over the space he had poured his heart into. Tonight had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. It had forced him to reaffirm why he had built this place in the first place, not just to serve fine meals, but to create an atmosphere where dignity and kindness were served alongside them. For those who had witnessed the evening unfold, the memory would not fade easily. They had come expecting nothing more than an elegant dining experience. Instead, they had left with a story, one that would stay with them, a reminder of the power of respect, the courage it took to stand against wrongdoing, and the quiet strength of those who refused to let injustice define them. And now, to you, the one watching, the one listening, the one bearing witness to this story. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have remained silent, allowing the moment to pass, hoping it wasn't your burden to bear? These moments aren't always obvious, but they are everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. And when they arrive, they demand a choice. Let this story be a reminder. Choose dignity. Choose empathy. Every single time. And if this story moved you, don't just walk away from it. Share it. Carry it forward. Because it's through these conversations, through these moments of reflection, that we grow together.